The death of Miss Marple. Tonight's story begins, but before we dive in, thank you for being here with us. I'm your host, Edward, and isn't it wonderful how these mysteries bring us together from all corners of the world? Leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from. I read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe for new stories every day. Now, let's begin the mystery. Chapter 1. The Death Notice in the Gazette. The spring morning in St Mary Mead arrived with its customary gentleness, daffodils nodding in cottage gardens, and the air carrying that peculiar sweetness that speaks of renewal and hope. It was precisely the sort of morning when death seemed an impossibility, a rude intrusion upon the natural order of things, which made the discovery all the more shocking when Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, spread the County Gazette across her breakfast table and let out a small, strangled cry. "Leonard," she called to her husband, who was buttering his toast with the methodical precision of a man who had performed this ritual for 30 years. "Leonard, you must see this at once." The Reverend Leonard Clement looked up from his morning paper with the patient expression of a clergyman long accustomed to his wife's excitements. But when he saw her face, pale as communion wafer, he set down his knife with unusual haste. "What is it, my dear?" Mrs. Clement's finger trembled as she pointed to a small boxed notice in the deaths column. The Reverend adjusted his spectacles and read aloud in a voice that grew progressively more incredulous. "Marple, Jane, peacefully, after a short illness. No callers." He looked up sharply. "But this cannot be right. We saw Miss Marple only 3 days ago at the parish council meeting. She seemed perfectly well." "More than well," Mrs. Clement whispered. "She was positively animated, asking all those questions about that poor Mrs. Vane's accident in the next village." The name hung between them like a shadow. Mrs. Honoria Vane, the wealthy widow who'd been found dead beside her sitting-room hearth just a week prior, apparently overcome by fumes from her portable heater. A tragic accident, the coroner had ruled, though Miss Marple had seemed oddly unsatisfied with the verdict. Within the hour, the news had spread through St. Mary Mead with the inexorable efficiency of village communication. At Gossington Hall, Lady Bantry received the telephone call from Mrs. Price Ridley and immediately burst into tears, something she had not done since her husband's funeral 5 years previous. "But Dolly," came Mrs. Price Ridley's voice through the receiver, sharp with the peculiar satisfaction that bearers of tragic news often possess. "Surely you must have noticed she'd been poorly. At her age, these things can happen so suddenly." Lady Bantry, known to her intimates as Dolly, clutched the telephone with hands that shook slightly. "She wasn't poorly," she said firmly. "Jane was never poorly. She had the constitution of a horse, and twice the sense of most people half her age." After hanging up the telephone, Dolly Bantry sat in her morning room and wept properly. The kind of tears that come from the heart and cannot be stemmed by social convention. Jane Marple had been more than a neighbour. She had been that rarest of creatures in a small village, a true friend. Someone who could be trusted with secrets, who never gossiped maliciously, and who possessed an uncanny ability to see through to the heart of human nature with both clarity and compassion. It was nearly noon when Inspector Slack arrived at the police station to find Constable Lake waiting with the Gazette folded to the deaths column. "Thought you'd want to know, sir," Lake said quietly. "Miss Marple, gone sudden-like." Slack took the paper and read the notice twice, his weathered face showing none of the emotion that had marked the reactions elsewhere in the village. He and Miss Marple had what might charitably be called a complicated relationship. She had assisted, or interfered, depending on one's perspective, in several of his cases over the years, often arriving at solutions through methods he found both baffling and irritating. Yet he had developed a grudging respect for the elderly spinster's remarkable intuitive abilities. "Any details?" he asked. "Dr. Haydock's handling arrangements, from what I hear, says the body's with him for the time being." Slack nodded slowly. "Right then. We'll pay our respects when appropriate. And Lake..." He paused, considering. "Keep this quiet for now. Don't want a circus." But even as he spoke, Slack felt an odd uneasiness settling in his chest. Miss Marple had been asking questions about the Vane woman's death just days ago. questions that had struck him as pertinent even if he'd been reluctant to admit it. The timing seemed remarkable, perhaps too remarkable. At the old vicarage, now Miss Marple's cottage since the new vicar had taken up residence in the modern house near the church, blinds had been drawn across every window. A black ribbon had been pinned to the front door, fluttering gently in the spring breeze like a small, mournful flag. Dr. Haydock, making his afternoon rounds, paused his Morris Minor outside the cottage and sat for a moment, staring at the drawn blinds. To any observer, he appeared to be paying his respects to a long-time patient and friend. In reality, he was conducting a careful reconnaissance, noting which neighbours were about, who might be watching, and whether his hastily conceived plan was holding water. The plan had been born of desperation and inspiration in equal measure. 3 days ago, Miss Marple had fainted in his surgery, not from illness, but from the sheer excitement of a revelation about Mrs. Vane's death that had left her momentarily overwhelmed. Upon reviving, she had fixed him with those sharp blue eyes and said with characteristic directness, "Doctor, I believe I know who killed Honoria Vane." But knowing and proving are two different matters entirely. What followed had been the most extraordinary consultation of his 40-year medical career. Miss Marple had outlined her suspicions with mathematical precision, explaining how Mrs. Vane's death was no accident but a carefully orchestrated murder. The problem, she explained, was that their culprit was clever and cautious, unlikely to make mistakes while under observation. But people behave differently when they believe they're safe, she had mused, when they think the one person who might expose them is no longer a threat. And so the plan had been born. Dr. Haydock would report Miss Marple's death. A natural passing after her fainting spell had apparently revealed a weak heart. The village would mourn, arrangements would be made, and in the meantime they would watch to see who breathed too easily, who moved too quickly to tie up loose ends, who revealed themselves through the very relief they felt at Miss Marple's convenient demise. As evening fell over St. Mary Mead, the cottage sat in darkness, its drawn blinds hiding secrets that would have astonished the mourning village. Behind those windows, very much alive and very much alert, Miss Marple sat in her familiar chair, knitting needles clicking softly in the gathering dusk, waiting to see what tomorrow would bring. In the distance, church bells tolled the hour, their bronze voices carrying across the village like a benediction. Or perhaps, Miss Marple thought with a small smile like a warning, Chapter 2, Dolly Bantry, Behind the Drawn Curtains. The morning after the death notice appeared brought with it a peculiar quality of silence to Saint Mary Mead, as though the village itself were holding its breath in respect for the departed. Lady Bantry had slept poorly, waking several times to the conviction that she had heard Jane's voice calling from the garden, only to remember with fresh pain that such calls would never come again. She had dressed in black, not mourning clothes precisely, for the funeral had not yet been arranged, but a subdued navy dress that seemed appropriate to her sombre mood. After a breakfast of tea and toast that tasted like sawdust, she found herself drawn repeatedly to the morning-room window that afforded the clearest view of Miss Marple's cottage across the village green. The sight that greeted her was both expected and deeply unsettling. Every window remained shrouded behind drawn blinds, giving the familiar cottage the appearance of a house that had closed its eyes in eternal sleep. The black ribbon on the front door stirred occasionally in the gentle breeze, a small movement that somehow made the stillness everywhere else more pronounced. "Oh, Jane," Dolly whispered to the empty room, pressing her fingers against the cool glass. "How can you simply be gone?" As the morning wore on, she maintained her vigil with the unconscious dedication of a sentry. The postman came and went, leaving letters in the box with visible reluctance, as though he too felt the weight of the cottage's silence. Mrs. Weatherby from the end cottage walked past twice, slowing her pace both times to stare at the drawn blinds with the frank curiosity that death invariably provokes in the living. It was nearly 11 o'clock when Dolly noticed the first thing that struck her as odd. Through her opera glasses, a liberty she would never have taken under normal circumstances, she could see into Miss Marple's sitting-room window, despite the drawn blinds leaving just a sliver of space at the bottom. There, clearly visible on the familiar chintz armchair, lay Jane's knitting. But something was wrong with it. Dolly had watched Jane knit for more than 20 years. She knew her friend's habits as well as her own. Jane always left her knitting needles crossed when she set her work aside, the yarn trailing from the left needle in a precise diagonal that prevented stitches from sliding off. It was as automatic as breathing, a gesture performed thousands of times without conscious thought. The needles lying on the chair were parallel. For several minutes Dolly stared at this small anomaly, telling herself she was imagining things, that grief was making her see significance where none existed. But the longer she looked, the more certain she became. Jane would never leave her knitting needles parallel. Never. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Penrith, the village undertaker, though his appearance was itself unusual. Instead of his customary formal approach in the hearse or his professional motor car, Mr. Penrith seemed to materialise from the direction of the church, walking with quick, nervous steps that spoke of a man uncomfortable with his current task. Dolly watched as he approached the cottage gate, hesitated, then appeared to think better of whatever he had intended. Instead of proceeding to the front door, he walked around to the back of the cottage, disappearing from view. She waited for the sound of the door knocker, for some sign of his business being conducted, but heard nothing. When he reappeared perhaps 10 minutes later, he was moving with considerably more haste, glancing back at the cottage as though it might follow him. He hurried away in the direction from which he had come, his usual measured dignity entirely absent. Most peculiar, Dolly murmured, making a mental note to inquire about Mr. Penrith's visit when she next encountered someone with reliable information. The afternoon brought Inspector Slack, arriving in his official capacity but with an unusual gentleness in his manner that surprised those who witnessed it. Dolly, abandoning any pretence of subtlety, put on her coat and walked directly across the green to intercept him. "Inspector," she called as he paused before the cottage gate, "might I have a word?" Slack turned, his weathered face showing genuine sympathy. "Lady Bantry, terrible news about Miss Marple. Terrible sudden." "Yes, it is," Dolly's voice caught slightly. "Inspector, I wonder, that is, I should very much like to see her, to say goodbye properly. We've been friends for so many years, and to think that she's gone without—" She stopped, unable to continue. Slack's expression grew uncomfortable. "I'm afraid that's not possible just now, Lady Bantry. Dr. Haydock's handling all the arrangements, and he's been quite specific about maintaining proper conditions, medical considerations, you understand. But surely, just for a moment. I wouldn't disturb anything. I simply need to see her once more." "The body's with the doctor," Slack said firmly, though not unkindly. "For the time being, at any rate. I'm sure when the time comes for proper viewing you'll be notified." Dolly felt tears prick her eyes. "She's really gone, then?" "There's no mistake." Something flickered across Slack's features, an expression too brief to interpret but somehow reassuring. "No mistake, Lady Bantry. But I give you my word, when it's appropriate you'll have your chance to pay your respects." As the inspector walked away, Dolly remained standing by the cottage gate, studying the black ribbon that marked her friend's passing. The ribbon itself seemed somehow wrong, though she couldn't immediately identify why. It was proper black silk, the correct width for mourning, but there was something about the way it was tied. In all her years of observing village mourning customs, Dolly had never seen a memorial ribbon tied with such precision. Village women tied bows with the unconscious skill of long practice, creating soft, flowing loops that spoke of hands accustomed to domestic tasks. This ribbon was secured with a flat, tight knot that had an almost military neatness to it. "Village women don't tie like that," she said aloud, then glanced around to make sure no one had heard her talking to herself. But the observation lingered as she walked slowly back to Gossington Hall. The parallel knitting needles, the undertaker's strange behaviour, the unusual ribbon knot, each detail might mean nothing individually, but together they formed a pattern that her instincts, sharpened by years of friendship with Jane Marple, recognised as significant. That evening, as darkness settled over the village, Dolly stood once more at her morning room window. The cottage across the green remained dark and silent, but she found herself wondering if Jane would have noticed the same small discrepancies that were troubling her. "What would you make of it all, my dear?" she whispered to the glass. "What would those sharp eyes of yours have seen that mine are missing?" The cottage offered no answers, but somewhere in the back of her mind a small voice that sounded remarkably like Jane Marple suggested that perhaps the most important thing she'd seen was not what was present, but what was absent. The undertaker who came but conducted no visible business, the body that was with the doctor but could not be viewed, and the knitting needles that told a story no one was supposed to read. As she prepared for bed, Dolly made a decision. Tomorrow she would pay closer attention to the small details that didn't quite fit. Jane had always said that the truth had a way of revealing itself to those who bothered to look properly. Perhaps it was time to start looking. Chapter 3. A wreath card written twice. Dawn crept over St. Mary Mead with unusual stealth, as though the very morning light were reluctant to disturb the morning village. Mrs. Clement, rising early as was her custom to prepare for the day's parish duties, was the first to notice the wreath that had appeared overnight at Miss Marple's gate. It was a magnificent thing, if wreaths could be called magnificent. A perfect circle of white lilies so fresh that dewdrops still clung to their petals like tears. The flowers were arranged with professional skill, each bloom positioned to create a harmony of texture and form that spoke of considerable expense and careful attention to detail. Mrs. Clement approached the gate with the mixture of curiosity and reverence that unexpected tributes inspire. The wreath had been placed with precision against the gate-post, angled so that any passer-by would see it clearly. Attached to the white ribbon that bound the arrangement was a small card, and it was this that caused Mrs. Clement to pause and examine the tribute more closely. The card bore a simple message written in black ink. To Miss Maple, with deepest respect. Mrs. Clement read it twice, her brow furrowing with each repetition. Miss Maple? She looked again at the elegant lilies, the expensive ribbon, the obviously professional arrangement, and felt that peculiar unease that comes when something appears both generous and wrong simultaneously. Hurrying back to the vicarage, she found her husband already dressed and preparing to conduct morning prayers. "Leonard," she said breathlessly, "there's a wreath at Miss Marple's gate, but the most extraordinary thing." The Reverend Clement listened to his wife's account with the patient attention he brought to all parish matters, but when she finished, his expression was thoughtful. "Most curious," he agreed. "One would expect that anyone wishing to honour Jane would know her name correctly. She's lived in this village for more than 50 years. Precisely what I thought. But Leonard, who could have placed it there? I was up at 5:30, and it was already in position. The florist in Much Benham doesn't open until 8 o'clock. By the time the village had properly awakened, news of the wreath had spread with characteristic efficiency. Lady Bantry, informed by her daily woman who had heard it from the baker's wife, walked across the green to see for herself. She found Inspector Slack already there, notebook in hand, examining the tribute with professional interest. "Morning, Lady Bantry," Slack said without looking up. "Quite a display, isn't it?" Dolly studied the wreath with the eye of someone who had organised numerous church flower arrangements over the years. The lilies were indeed beautiful, but there was something almost aggressive about their perfection, as though they were trying too hard to convey a message of respect and sorrow. "The card is wrong," she said simply. "Wrong how?" "Look at it carefully, Inspector. Not just the name, though that's obvious enough. Look at the ink." Slack bent closer, and after a moment his expression sharpened. The card showed clear evidence of two different writing implements. The sentiment, "with deepest respect," was written in what appeared to be blue ink, while Miss Maple was inscribed in black. More telling still, the black ink showed the slight bleeding characteristic of a fountain pen, writing over already dried ballpoint ink. "Someone corrected it," Slack muttered. "Wrote the card, realised the mistake, tried to fix it." "But why not simply use a new card?" Dolly asked. Any florist would have provided another. It was a question that occupied both of them as they made their separate ways to the florist in Much Benham later that morning. Mr. Hedges, proprietor of Ben and Bloom's for 30 years, received them with the subdued professional manner appropriate to discussions of funeral flowers. "Terrible loss, Miss Marple," he said, shaking his head. "Ordered the wreath yesterday evening, they did. Very specific about the lilies, nothing but white, and arranged in a perfect circle. Cost was no object, they said." "They?" Slack inquired. "Who exactly placed the order?" "Telephone call, Inspector. Came in just after closing time. I'd already locked up, but I always answer the phone in case of emergencies. Voice was a bit muffled, like they had a cold perhaps. Said they'd seen the notice in the Gazette and wanted to pay respects immediately." Dolly exchanged glances with Slack. "The Gazette only came out yesterday morning," she observed. "Rather prompt, wasn't it?" Mr. Hedges nodded enthusiastically. "That's what struck me as well. Most folk take a day or two to arrange flowers after a death notice appears, but this caller was most insistent. Had to be delivered before dawn, they said. Paid extra for the special service." "And the card?" Slack asked. "Did they dictate the message?" "Indeed they did. To Miss Marple, with deepest respect. I wrote it down exactly as they said it." Mr. Hedges paused, looking puzzled. "Though I must say, when I prepared the card this morning it looked rather odd. Almost as though someone had tampered with it." The florist led them to his workbench, where a duplicate order form lay beside scattered lily petals and scraps of ribbon. "I always prepare these tributes just before delivery," he explained. "When I went to attach the card, the name looked different somehow. Smudged. Almost as though it had been changed." "Changed how?" Dolly asked. "Well, I'd written Miss Marple as they'd dictated, you see, but somehow it had become Miss Maple. I assumed I'd made an error. These old hands aren't as steady as they once were, so I thought nothing of it." Slack made notes while Dolly examined the order form. The original writing was clear enough. Miss Marple in Mr. Hedges' careful script. But she could see faint traces where the R and P had been altered, turned into P and L with different ink. "Mr. Hedges," she said carefully, "where did this telephone call originate?" "Did the caller mention where they were ringing from?" "Funny you should ask. There was an echo on the line, the sort you get from those public telephone boxes, and I could swear I heard traffic in the background, motor cars passing by." After leaving the florist, Slack and Dolly drove slowly through the surrounding villages, noting the locations of public telephone boxes. There were 3 within reasonable distance of St. Mary Mead, one outside the railway station, one by the village green in Much Benham, and one that stood rather isolated beside the main road near Vane House in the neighbouring hamlet. "Curious timing," Slack observed, as they paused beside this last kiosk. "Wreath ordered the evening the death notice appeared, delivered before dawn, and the card altered after it left the florist's hands." Dolly stepped out of the police car and walked to the telephone box. The door opened with a small squeal of hinges that needed oiling. Inside, the narrow shelf beneath the telephone was dusty with disuse, but she noticed something that made her call Slack over immediately. "Look there," she said, pointing to the shelf. "Pollen grains." "White pollen, unless I'm much mistaken." Slack bent to examine the tiny specks of white dust scattered across the shelf's surface. "Lily pollen," he confirmed. "Same type as on that wreath, I'd wager." But there was more. Beside the pollen, barely visible unless one looked carefully, was a small smear of what appeared to be tar or grease, as though someone with stained fingers had rested their hand on the shelf while speaking. As they drove back towards St. Mary Mead, both were silent, occupied with their own thoughts. The wreath had seemed like a simple tribute from a well-meaning villager, but the evidence suggested something far more calculated. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to place flowers at Miss Marple's gate, within hours of her death being announced. Someone who had access to the telephone box near Vane House. Someone whose fingers bore traces of tar, and someone who had made a telling error with the deceased's name. "Inspector," Dolly said as they approached the village green, "you mentioned that Miss Marple had been asking questions about Mrs. Vane's accident." "She had indeed. Seemed to think there was more to it than met the eye. And now she's dead, and someone's very eager to pay their respects with expensive flowers." Dolly gazed thoughtfully at the cottage where the wreath still stood guard by the gate. One might almost think they were relieved. Slack said nothing, but his knuckles whitened slightly on the steering wheel. The same thought had occurred to him, and he didn't like the implications one bit. If Miss Marple's death was as convenient as it appeared to be for someone, then perhaps her final case was far from over. Indeed, it might just be beginning. Chapter 4. Dr. Haydock locks the parlour. Dr. Haydock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage shortly after noon, carrying his black medical bag and wearing the grave expression that his profession demanded in such circumstances. To the casual observer, and there were several positioned strategically behind lace curtains and garden hedges, he appeared to be conducting the melancholy business that follows any death in a small village. The truth was rather different. Inside the cottage, Miss Marple sat in her kitchen, very much alive and consuming a light luncheon of tea and digestive biscuits. She had spent the morning in productive observation from her darkened sitting room, noting through a gap in the blinds exactly who had lingered to examine the wreath, who had hurried past with averted eyes, and who had seemed altogether too interested in the cottage's apparent emptiness. "Well, Doctor," she said as Haydock entered through the back door, "I believe our little deception is proceeding admirably. Half the village has found reason to walk past my gate this morning." Dr. Haydock set down his bag with a sigh that mixed relief and apprehension in equal measure. "I've just had a most interesting conversation with Inspector Slack about that wreath. Someone was remarkably eager to honour your memory, Jane. Remarkably eager indeed." "Yes, I observed its arrival from my bedroom window. Quite spectacular, wasn't it? Though I couldn't help noticing that whoever placed it took considerable care to position it where it would be most visible." Miss Marple poured the doctor a cup of tea with steady hands. "I don't suppose you happened to notice anything unusual about the card?" Slack mentioned the name was incorrect and that the ink suggested alteration. "How very telling," Miss Marple murmured. "Nothing quite betrays nervousness like attempting to correct one's mistakes in haste." Dr. Haydock accepted the tea gratefully. The strain of maintaining the charade was beginning to tell on him, though he had to admit there was something rather exhilarating about being party to such an elaborate investigation. "I've had to turn away several callers already," he reported. "Mrs. Clement wished to discuss funeral arrangements, and Lady Bantry was most persistent about viewing—" He paused delicately. "Your remains." "Poor Dolly," Miss Marple said with genuine affection. "She's taking this very hard, I'm afraid." "But, Doctor, we cannot afford to let sentiment interfere with our purpose. If our suspicions about Mrs. Vane's death are correct, then someone in this village is a murderer. Someone who believed themselves safe until I began asking inconvenient questions." "And who now believes themselves safe again, Doctor?" Haydock added grimly. "Precisely. Which brings us to the next phase of our plan." Miss Marple set down her teacup with characteristic precision. "You must make it known that, for reasons of public health and personal dignity, my parlour is to remain locked and no viewing will be permitted. The explanation should satisfy most inquiries while ensuring that no one discovers the rather obvious fact that there is no body to view." Dr. Haydock nodded, though he looked uncomfortable with the deception required. "And how long do we maintain this fiction?" "Until someone makes the mistake we're waiting for," Miss Marple replied with a small smile. "In my experience, Doctor, guilt is a most restless companion. It drives people to actions they would never contemplate under normal circumstances." Later that afternoon, Dr. Haydock made his pronouncement to the assembled worthies of St. Mary Mead, who had gathered at the Bluebird Tea Room with the ostensible purpose of taking refreshment, but the actual intent of sharing and gathering information about the village's recent tragedy. "For reasons of medical protocol and respect for the deceased," he announced to the hushed assembly, "there will be no viewing of Miss Marple's remains. The parlour at the cottage has been sealed, and I must ask that everyone respect these arrangements." Lady Bantry, who had been hoping against hope for one final glimpse of her dear friend, felt tears prick her eyes anew. "But surely, Doctor, just for a moment—" "I'm afraid not, Lady Bantry, Doctor," Haydock said gently, and his tone carried such finality that even Dolly's determination faltered. "The circumstances make it inadvisable." Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to let delicacy stand in the way of curiosity, leaned forward with interest. "Circumstances, Doctor. Was there something unusual about Miss Marple's passing?" Dr. Haydock's expression grew professionally distant. "Nothing that need concern the village, Mrs. Price Ridley. Simply a matter of maintaining proper standards in difficult situations." The conversation might have continued along these lines indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the arrival of two individuals whose presence immediately shifted the tea room's atmosphere: Giles Vane and Miss Beatrice Pike, nephew and companion respectively to the recently deceased Mrs. Honoria Vane. Giles Vane was a man of perhaps 45, with the soft features and pale complexion of someone who spent his days behind a desk rather than in physical labour. His suit was expensive but ill-fitting, suggesting prosperity recently acquired rather than inherited. Miss Pike, a woman of indeterminate middle age, possessed the colourless efficiency that marked professional companions throughout England. Competent, self-effacing, and perpetually anxious about her position. "Terribly sorry to interrupt," Giles said, his voice carrying the forced joviality of a man uncomfortable with social situations. "Heard about Miss Marple's passing and thought we should pay our respects. Shocking business, absolutely shocking." There was something in his tone, a note of relief barely concealed beneath conventional expressions of sympathy, that made several people glance at him curiously. Mrs. Clement, always charitable in her assessments, attributed it to the awkwardness many felt when confronting mortality. Others were less generous in their interpretations. "Very kind of you both, Doctor," Haydock replied carefully. Miss Pike spoke for the first time, her voice soft and deferential. Miss Marple was so interested in dear Mrs. Vane's accident. She came to see us several times, asking the most detailed questions about the portable heater and the evening's arrangements. She paused, apparently overcome by the memory. "Such a tragedy that she won't see justice done for poor Mrs. Vane." "Justice?" Inspector Slack's voice cut through the tea-room chatter with professional sharpness. He had entered unnoticed during the conversation, and now stood just inside the doorway, his presence immediately commanding attention. Giles Vane's face flushed slightly. "Figure of speech, Inspector. Aunt Honoria's death was ruled accidental, of course, but you know how these amateur investigators can be, always seeing mysteries where none exist." "Miss Marple wasn't one for imagining things," Lady Bantry said firmly. "If she thought there was something suspicious about Mrs. Vane's death, then there very likely was." "Yes, well," Giles said, his discomfort now obvious. "That's all academic now, isn't it? With Miss Marple gone, I suppose the matter rests where it should, with the proper authorities who've already reached their conclusions." The silence that followed this statement was pregnant with unspoken thoughts. Several of those present had the distinct impression that Giles Vane was rather too pleased with the finality he attributed to Miss Marple's death. Miss Pike, perhaps sensing the tension, attempted to change the subject. "The portable heater has been such a source of distress," she murmured. "I've been thinking we should dispose of it entirely. Sell it for scrap, perhaps, and try to put the whole dreadful business behind us." Inspector Slack made a note in his notebook, though his expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Rather hasty, isn't it? The coroner's office might want to examine it again if new questions arise." "But what questions could arise now?" Giles asked, and again that note of relief crept into his voice. "The one person who seemed inclined to ask them is no longer with us. God rest her soul." As if to emphasize his sympathy, he reached for his wallet and placed a £1 note on the table. "Please, allow me to settle everyone's bill today. It's the least I can do in Miss Marple's memory." The gesture was generous, but somehow it felt more like a celebration than a tribute. As Giles and Miss Pike departed, leaving behind them the faint impression of people who had shed an unwelcome burden, the remaining occupants of the tea-room exchanged meaningful glances. "Rum behaviour," Inspector Slack observed quietly to Doctor Haydock as the tea-room gradually emptied. "Indeed," the Doctor agreed. "One might almost think they were relieved that certain questions would no longer be asked." What neither man said, but both were thinking, was that their elaborate deception was already bearing fruit. If Miss Marple's death had silenced inconvenient inquiries, then perhaps those inquiries had been more dangerous to someone than anyone had realised. Chapter 5. Morning at the Bluebird Tea Room. The morning following Doctor. Haydock's pronouncement about the locked parlour brought with it a peculiar atmosphere to the Bluebird tea room. Word had spread through St. Mary Mead with the efficiency characteristic of small communities, and by 10:30 the establishment was filled with a subdued murmur of voices discussing the unusual circumstances surrounding Miss Marple's final arrangements. Mrs. Clement sat at her customary table by the window, stirring her tea with mechanical precision, while her thoughts wandered far from the pleasant surroundings. Across from her, Lady Bantry occupied herself with the systematic destruction of a perfectly innocent scone, her appetite clearly affected by the morning's contemplations. "I cannot stop thinking about Jane's last visit," Mrs. Clement said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was only 4 days ago, wasn't it? She seemed so animated, full of purpose." "What did she say exactly?" Dolly asked, abandoning her assault on the scone to give her full attention to the vicar's wife. Mrs. Clement closed her eyes, as though to better recall the conversation. She had been to see the Vanes, Mrs. Vane's nephew, and that companion of hers. Jane seemed troubled by something she had observed there. She mentioned that someone had tidied the Vane sitting room too well. Tidied too well? Whatever could she have meant by that? She said the details were all wrong for a woman who had lived alone with only a companion for assistance. The clock, for instance. Mrs. Vane always wound her mantel clock on Sunday evenings after church. It was as regular as breathing, Jane said. But when she died on that Thursday, the clock had been wound fresh, still running strong when the body was discovered Friday morning. Dolly leaned forward with interest. Jane noticed that. Oh, that was merely the beginning. The log basket beside the fireplace had been moved from its usual position on the left side of the grate to the right. Jane said she remembered it distinctly from her previous visits because Mrs. Vane was left-handed and always kept the basket within easy reach of her dominant hand. The two women sat in contemplative silence, each turning over these seemingly trivial details in their minds. It was the sort of observation that Miss Marple had specialised in, the small discrepancies that others dismissed as unimportant but which to her trained eye suggested deliberate manipulation of a scene. Their reverie was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who approached their table with the careful courtesy he reserved for the village's more respectable residents. "Ladies," he said, touching his cap, "might I join you for a moment? There are 1 or 2 matters I'd like to discuss." Permission granted, Slack settled into the remaining chair and signalled the waitress for tea. His presence immediately altered the dynamic of the conversation, introducing an official gravity that made both women straighten unconsciously in their seats. "I've been thinking about what you mentioned yesterday, Lady Bantry," he began, regarding the black ribbon on Miss Marple's door. "You said the knot struck you as unusual." "It did indeed," Dolly confirmed. "Far too precise for ordinary mourning customs, almost military in its execution. I took the liberty of examining it this morning," Slack continued. "The ribbon itself is proper enough. Good quality silk, appropriate width. But the knot is what you might call a reef knot. Perfect in its symmetry, tied with considerable skill." Mrs. Clement looked puzzled. "Is that significant, Inspector?" "It might be. Reef knots aren't the sort of thing most people know how to tie properly. Sailors learn them, of course, some military men. But your average village resident?" He shook his head. "They'd tie a simple bow or perhaps a granny knot. Nothing so technically precise." At that moment, as though summoned by their discussion of the Vane household, Miss Beatrice Pike appeared in the tea-room doorway. She stood uncertainly for a moment, scanning the occupied tables with the hesitant manner of someone unaccustomed to social situations. Lady Bantry, displaying the automatic hospitality of her class, gestured toward their table. "Miss Pike, please join us. We were just—" "Thank you," Miss Pike said quietly, settling into the chair Slack vacantly pulled out for her. "I hope I'm not intruding. I find myself rather at loose ends these days. Mrs. Vane's death has left such an enormous gap in one's routine." The waitress brought tea, and for several minutes the conversation remained safely within the boundaries of conventional condolence. Miss Pike spoke movingly of her late employer's kindness, of the comfortable arrangement they had shared, and of her uncertainty about the future now that her position had ended so abruptly. It was Mrs. Clement who, with characteristic directness, broached the subject that occupied all their thoughts. "Miss Pike, you knew Mrs. Vane's habits as well as anyone. Did you notice anything unusual about the sitting room on the evening she died?" Miss Pike's teacup rattled slightly against its saucer as she set it down. "Unusual? I'm not sure what you mean." "Small things," Mrs. Clement persisted gently. "Changes in the room's arrangement, perhaps?" Miss Marple seemed to think there were discrepancies. "Miss Marple visited us several times after Mrs. Vane's accident," Miss Pike said carefully. "She asked the most detailed questions about the evening's routine. About the portable heater, particularly." "The heater that caused the tragedy?" Dolly observed. "Yes." Miss Pike's voice grew even quieter. "Such a dreadful thing. Mrs. Vane had used it safely for years, but that night, the fumes somehow accumulated. The vent must have become blocked, though we never could determine how." Inspector Slack made a note in his book. "The heater's been examined, I suppose?" "Oh yes, thoroughly. But Mr. Giles, Mrs. Vane's nephew, he's been most insistent that we dispose of it. Says it brings back too many painful memories. I quite agree. I can hardly bear to look at the thing." There was something in Miss Pike's manner, a brittleness beneath her soft-spoken composure, that suggested deeper currents of distress. Her hands, Dolly noticed, showed signs of recent rough work, small cuts and abrasions that seemed inconsistent with the light duties of a companion. "You've been busy with estate matters, I expect," Dolly said conversationally. "Indeed." "So much to sort through, so many papers to organise. Mrs. Vane kept everything, you know. Bills, receipts, correspondence dating back years. I've been burning the irrelevant documents. There's no point in keeping such clutter." "Burning them?" Slack inquired with casual interest. "In the kitchen range." It seemed the most efficient method, though I must say, some of the older papers are proving remarkably stubborn. The ink seems to have set so deeply. She trailed off, as though realising she had said more than intended. At that moment, Giles Vane himself entered the tea room, his face lighting with apparent relief when he spotted Miss Pike at their table. He approached with the hurried manner of someone who had been searching anxiously. "Beatrice, there you are," I was beginning to worry. He nodded politely to the others before addressing his aunt's former companion. "I'm afraid there's been a small crisis at the house. The chimney sweep has arrived unexpectedly. Something about soot falling into the kitchen range. He says the flue needs immediate attention." Miss Pike rose with evident agitation. "But I was in the middle of... That is, I had planned to finish sorting this afternoon." "I'm sure it can wait," Giles said firmly, taking her arm. "These tradesmen have such inconvenient schedules." As they prepared to leave, Giles turned back to the table with an expression of studied casualness. "I don't suppose any of you have heard when Miss Marple's funeral is to be held. We should like to pay our respects properly." "Dr. Haydock is handling all arrangements," Slack replied neutrally. "I'm sure the details will be announced when appropriate." Of course," Giles said, but something in his eyes suggested the timing was of more than casual interest to him. After the pair had departed, leaving behind them a faint impression of haste and concealed anxiety, the three remaining occupants of the table sat in thoughtful silence. "Chimney sweep," Mrs. Clement murmured finally. "How remarkably convenient." "And papers being burned in the kitchen range," Dolly added. "Papers that are remarkably stubborn to destroy." Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "I think," he said quietly, "it might be time to pay an unofficial visit to Vane House, before any more inconvenient evidence goes up in smoke." As they prepared to leave the tea room, none of them noticed the figure watching from the window of the cottage across the green. A figure who had observed every coming and going with sharp, intelligent eyes, and who was beginning to see the pattern that connected a reef knot, a corrected wreath card, and papers that burned with unusual reluctance. Chapter 6, The Black Ribbon, and a Seaman's Knot. The afternoon light was beginning to fade when Lady Bantry found herself unable to concentrate on the novel she had been attempting to read. The conversation at the Bluebird tea room had left her with a restless energy that demanded action, and despite the impropriety of the impulse, she felt compelled to visit Miss Marple's cottage once more. The walk across the village green took her past the usual collection of afternoon activities: children playing hopscotch near the church wall, Mrs. Weatherby hanging washing in her back garden, and old Mr. Carmichael dozing on his bench beside the war memorial. It was all perfectly ordinary, perfectly peaceful, and yet Dolly felt as though she were walking through a stage set where everyone was playing their assigned roles, while something far more significant occurred behind the scenes. The cottage stood as it had for the past 2 days, blinds drawn, the black ribbon fluttering from its post beside the door. But as Dolly approached the gate, her attention was drawn not to the obvious signs of mourning, but to details she had not previously noticed. The ribbon itself was secured with a knot that, upon closer examination, was indeed remarkably precise. She had tied countless ribbons in her lifetime, for gifts, for decorations, for various charitable endeavours, and she recognised the difference between casual domestic tying and something executed with technical skill. This was no simple bow hastily fashioned by grieving hands. More intriguing still were the faint stains at the ribbon's ends. What she had initially taken for ordinary wear now revealed itself as something more specific, a slight darkening that had the distinctive gleam of tar. It was barely visible unless one looked closely, but once noticed it was unmistakable. Dolly glanced around to ensure she was unobserved, then leaned closer to examine the cottage's front windowsill. There, scattered like tiny diamonds across the painted wood, were grains of what could only be pollen from the lily wreath. The flowers had been removed earlier that day, presumably by Doctor Haydock or some other well-meaning soul, but their presence lingered in these minute traces. The juxtaposition struck her as significant. Lily pollen on the sill beneath a window, tar stains on a ribbon tied with sailor's precision. 2 distinct elements that seemed to suggest the presence of someone with both access to the wreath and familiarity with maritime knots. Her contemplation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Inspector Slack emerged from the direction of the police station, walking with the purposeful stride of a man engaged in official business. "Lady Bantry," he said, touching his cap in greeting. "I might have known I'd find you here. Can't stay away from the scene, can we?" "I suppose I'm being rather morbid," Dolly admitted, "but I keep feeling as though Jane would want me to notice things. She always said the most important clues were the ones people overlooked because they seemed too obvious." Slack's expression grew thoughtful. "Speaking of things people overlook, I've just come from the Gazette office. Had a word with young Morrison about that death notice." "Oh? Was there something unusual about it?" "You might say that." Slack pulled out his notebook and flipped to a marked page. The notice as originally submitted read simply, "Marple, Jane. Peacefully, after a short illness. Standard form, nothing remarkable." But sometime after midnight on the night before publication, an addition was made. "The no-callers line?" "Exactly. Morrison says it came in as what they call a correction slip, a last-minute addition that's usually reserved for undertakers or doctors who need to amend funeral arrangements. The slip was signed with Dr. Haydock's name." Dolly felt a chill of unease. "And Dr. Haydock denies sending any such correction. Says he was home all evening and wouldn't have thought to add such a line in any case. It's not the sort of thing he'd typically include in a death notice." They stood in silence for a moment, both contemplating the implications. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to discourage visitors to Miss Marple's cottage, someone with either access to official correction procedures or the audacity to forge a doctor's signature. "Inspector," Dolly said slowly, "have you had an opportunity to speak with Mr. Penrith about his visit here yesterday?" "That's next on my list, though I suspect I know what he'll tell me. They found the undertaker at his establishment on the far side of the village, a dignified building that managed to suggest both comfort and solemnity without being oppressive. Mr. Penrith received them in his office, a room furnished with the sort of dark wood and subdued lighting appropriate to his profession. "Inspector Lady Bantry," he said, rising from behind his desk. "I assume this concerns poor Miss Marple's arrangements?" "In a manner of speaking," Slack replied. We're trying to establish exactly who's been involved in the preparations. I understand you called at the cottage yesterday?" Mr. Penrith's expression grew puzzled. "Called at the cottage? I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding, Inspector. I haven't been to Miss Marple's cottage at all. Dr. Haydock made it quite clear that all arrangements were to go through him directly." "But you were seen there," Dolly interjected. "Yesterday morning, walking around to the back of the cottage." "I'm sorry, Lady Bantry, but that's quite impossible. I was in Much Benham all morning yesterday, consulting with the monument works about the Henderson Memorial. I have receipts if you'd like to verify." Slack made notes while Dolly tried to reconcile what she had observed with Mr. Penrith's account. She had been certain she'd seen the undertaker approach the cottage, but if he had been elsewhere... "Mr. Penrith," she said carefully, "do you keep your professional attire here at the establishment?" "Naturally. The formal coat and top hat are standard equipment, though I don't always wear them for consultation visits. And they would be recognisable to most villagers." "I should think so. I've been serving St. Mary Mead for more than 20 years. As they left the undertaker's, Slack voiced what they were both thinking. Someone wanted it to appear that funeral arrangements were proceeding normally. Dressed the part, made the visit look official, but avoided any actual contact that might have exposed the deception. "Which suggests," Dolly added, "that whoever it was had access to appropriate clothing and enough familiarity with village customs to carry off the impersonation." They walked slowly back toward the village centre, each lost in contemplation of the growing list of deceptions that surrounded Miss Marple's supposed death. The forged correction slip, the impersonated undertaker, the precisely tied ribbon with its telltale tar stains. Each element suggested careful planning by someone with both knowledge of local procedures and a pressing need to maintain the fiction of Miss Marple's demise. "Inspector," Dolly said as they approached the cottage once more, "I've been thinking about what Miss Pike said regarding the portable heater. She mentioned that Mrs. Vane had used it safely for years, but that somehow the vent became blocked." "What of it?" "Well, Jane always said that when something worked perfectly for years and then suddenly failed, one should look for human intervention rather than mechanical failure." Slack stopped walking and turned to face her. "Are you suggesting Mrs. Vane's death wasn't accidental?" "I'm suggesting that Jane thought it wasn't, and that someone was very relieved when her question stopped being asked." Dolly gestured toward the cottage with its drawn blinds and mourning ribbon. "All of this elaborate theatre, what purpose does it serve except to convince someone that they're safe from further investigation?" As if to emphasise her point, a figure appeared at the far end of the village green, walking quickly in the direction of Vane House. Even at a distance they could identify Miss Beatrice Pike, moving with the hurried gait of someone anxious to complete an urgent task. "Come on," Slack said grimly. "I think it's time we paid that promised visit to Vane House," before any more evidence disappears up a chimney. As they set off in pursuit, neither noticed the curtain that twitched slightly in the darkened cottage behind them, or the sharp eyes that watched their departure with considerable interest and growing satisfaction. Chapter 7. The Phone Box by Vane House. The walk to Vane House took Inspector Slack and Lady Bantry along the winding lane that connected St. Mary Mead to its neighbouring hamlet. The afternoon had grown overcast, lending a grey quality to the light that seemed to match the increasingly sombre nature of their investigation. As they approached the substantial Victorian house that had been Mrs. Honoria Vane's final residence, both were struck by how isolated it appeared from the main thoroughfare. "Perfect location for someone who valued privacy," Dolly observed, noting the high hedges that screened the property from casual observation. "Or for someone who needed to conduct business without witnesses," Slack replied grimly. It was as they drew nearer to the house that they spotted the red telephone box standing sentinel beside the main gate. The kiosk was positioned with what seemed like deliberate convenience, close enough to the house to be easily accessed by its occupants, yet public enough to avoid suspicion from anyone who might notice its use. Slack approached the telephone box with the methodical attention to detail that characterised his professional work. The door opened with a protesting squeal that suggested infrequent use, and the interior bore the musty smell of neglect that accumulated in seldom visited places. "Well now," he murmured, examining the narrow shelf beneath the telephone apparatus. "What have we here?" Lady Bantry peered over his shoulder to see what had captured his attention. The shelf's surface, dusty from months of disuse, told a story that became clear once one knew how to read it. Scattered across the wood were the same tiny grains of white pollen they had observed at Miss Marple's cottage, and beside them, barely visible against the dark surface, was a small smear of the same tar-like substance they had noticed on the mourning ribbon. "The wreath," Dolly said quietly. "This is where the order was placed." Slack nodded, making careful notes. "And recently, by the look of it. This pollen hasn't been here long enough to settle into the dust properly." They emerged from the telephone box to find themselves face to face with Giles Vane, who had apparently been approaching from the direction of the house. His expression showed surprise and, unless they were mistaken, a flicker of something that might have been alarm. "Inspector Slack, Lady Bantry," he said with forced joviality. "What brings you to our little corner of the world?" "Official business, Mr. Vane," Slack replied neutrally, "though I confess we were just admiring the convenience of having a public telephone so close to hand." "Yes, rather useful," Giles agreed, though his eyes kept darting toward the telephone box as though it might somehow incriminate him. "Though I can't say I use it much myself. Have a perfectly good telephone in the house, of course." "Of course," Dolly murmured, "though I suppose there might be occasions when one would prefer the privacy of a public box. When making arrangements of a delicate nature, for instance." Giles's colour heightened slightly. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Lady Bantry." At that moment, Miss Beatrice Pike appeared from around the side of the house, moving with the quick, nervous steps of someone interrupted in the middle of an important task. Her hands, Dolly noticed, bore fresh evidence of manual labour, streaks of what appeared to be soot mixed with the tar stains they had observed previously. "Mr. Giles," she called breathlessly, "the chimney sweep says he needs to speak with you about the flue. Something about the draft not drawing properly." "Ah, yes, the chimney problem," Giles said, seizing upon the interruption with obvious relief. "You'll excuse me, Inspector. These domestic matters require immediate attention." But Slack was not so easily dismissed. "Before you go, Mr. Vane, I wonder if you might clarify something. You mentioned at the tea room that you rarely use public telephones, yet someone placed an order for funeral flowers from this very box. Expensive flowers, delivered with unusual haste." "I'm sure I wouldn't know anything about that," Giles replied, but his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. Miss Pike, who had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation, suddenly spoke up. "Perhaps it was someone else entirely, Inspector. This box is available to anyone, after all. The greengrocer in Much Benham, perhaps, or—" She stopped abruptly, as though realising she had said something unwise. "The greengrocer?" Slack inquired with interest. "You've used this telephone to call the greengrocer, Miss Pike." "I might have done," she said defensively, "when we needed supplies delivered quickly. Mrs. Vane was very particular about having fresh vegetables." Dolly found herself studying Miss Pike's appearance more closely. The woman's clothing, while neat and appropriate to her station, showed signs of recent heavy work. There were streaks of ash on her skirt, and her fingernails, despite obvious attempts at cleaning, retained traces of the same dark substance they had found in the telephone box. "Miss Pike," she said conversationally, "you mentioned burning papers in the kitchen range. That must be dusty work." "Indeed it is," Miss Pike replied, though her voice had grown wary. "Mrs. Vane accumulated such a quantity of old documents over the years. Bills, receipts, correspondence that's no longer relevant. It seemed the most efficient way to dispose of them." "And the portable heater?" Slack asked suddenly. "I understand that's to be disposed of as well." Both Giles and Miss Pike exchanged a glance that was not lost on their observers. It was Giles who answered, his tone carefully casual. "Beatrice feels it would be best to have it removed entirely. Too many painful associations, you understand." "Quite understandable," Slack agreed. "Though I hope you won't mind if we have another look at it first. For the record, you understand." The silence that followed this request was pregnant with tension. Finally Miss Pike spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's already been partially dismantled, Inspector. For cleaning purposes, The soot and residue, you know. We thought it best to clean it thoroughly before disposal." "Show us," Slack said simply. The reluctance with which both Giles and Miss Pike led them toward the house was palpable. As they walked up the gravel drive, Dolly noticed several details that struck her as significant. A coil of tarred rope beside the garden shed, clearly of maritime origin. A sailor's chest visible through an open doorway, its brass fittings green with age. And most tellingly, the acrid smell of burning that hung in the air despite the absence of any visible smoke. At the kitchen door, Miss Pike hesitated. "Perhaps this isn't the best time, Inspector. The chimney sweep is still working, and everything is rather at 6s and 7s. But Slack was already past her, stepping into the kitchen where the evidence of hasty destruction was immediately apparent. The range was still warm, its door standing open to reveal the remains of what had clearly been a substantial quantity of paper. Fragments of charred documents littered the floor, and the smell of recent burning was overwhelming. On the kitchen table, spread across several sheets of newspaper, lay the dismantled components of the portable heater that had allegedly claimed Mrs. Vane's life. Even to Dolly's inexpert eye, the device showed signs of having been tampered with. The flue collar bore traces of what appeared to be soap residue, and fragments of what might have been wool or cotton clung to the interior surfaces. "Interesting modifications," Slack observed, making detailed notes, almost as though someone had deliberately blocked the ventilation system. Miss Pike's composure finally cracked. "It was an accident," she said desperately. "A terrible accident. The heater had been working perfectly, and then suddenly someone made sure it wouldn't work properly anymore," Slack finished grimly. "Someone who knew exactly how to create a deadly accumulation of fumes while making it appear accidental." As he spoke, his attention was drawn to something else on the kitchen mantelpiece, a length of black ribbon, cut to precisely the same dimensions as the mourning ribbon on Miss Marple's door. The ends showed the same telltale tar stains, and scattered around it were the unmistakable remnants of someone's repeated attempts to tie and retie a complex knot. The evidence was mounting rapidly, but even as Slack began to formulate the charges he would soon be making, he couldn't shake the feeling that the most important revelations were yet to come. Chapter 8. Footsteps at the Sleeping Cottage. The evening had settled over St. Mary Mead with unusual quietude, as though the village itself were observing a period of mourning for its departed sleuth. Most residents had retired early, their windows dark before 9 o'clock, leaving the streets to the pale illumination of the moon and the occasional pool of light cast by the old-fashioned street lamps. At the cottage that bore Miss Marple's name, all appeared as it had for the past 3 days. Blinds drawn tight, the black ribbon fluttering softly beside the door, and an air of finality that suggested the end of all earthly concerns. To any casual observer, it was simply another house where death had called, now settled into the patient waiting that precedes burial. The reality, however, was quite different. Miss Marple sat in her kitchen, well away from any window that might betray her presence to watching eyes. She had spent the evening in productive contemplation, reviewing the various reports that Dr. Haydock had brought her throughout the day. The doctor's account of the afternoon's discoveries at Vane House had been particularly illuminating, confirming suspicions that had been forming in her mind since the morning the death notice first appeared. "Most satisfactory progress," she murmured to herself, setting aside her knitting to consult the notebook where she had been recording her observations. "Though I rather suspect our quarry will not remain passive much longer." As if summoned by her words, the sound of footsteps on the garden path reached her ears. They were soft, cautious steps that spoke of someone moving with deliberate stealth, pausing occasionally as though the walker were listening for sounds of detection. Miss Marple extinguished her small reading lamp and moved silently to the kitchen window, positioning herself where she could observe without being seen. The moon was bright enough to illuminate the garden clearly, and she had an excellent view of anyone approaching the cottage. The figure that emerged from the shadows moved with the confidence of someone familiar with the cottage's layout. It was clearly a person of medium height and build, dressed in dark clothing that blended effectively with the night. Most significantly, the intruder carried what appeared to be a key, which they used to unlock the front door with practiced efficiency. Miss Marple smiled grimly. Dr. Haydock had been quite correct in his prediction that someone would attempt to retrieve potentially incriminating evidence from her cottage. The bait they had prepared was about to be taken. The intruder moved through the cottage with purposeful direction, heading straight for the sitting room where Miss Marple's writing bureau stood against the far wall. By the faint light filtering through the blinds, she could observe their movements as they began a systematic search of the bureau's drawers and compartments. It was the work of several minutes before the searcher found what they were looking for, a large brown envelope that Miss Marple had placed prominently in the bureau's main compartment. The envelope bore a label written in her characteristic neat handwriting, Vane, Heater Receipts. The intruder's relief was palpable even from Miss Marple's distant vantage point. They clutched the envelope with obvious satisfaction, then moved quickly back toward the front door. The entire operation had taken less than 10 minutes, executed with an efficiency that spoke of careful planning and urgent motivation. Miss Marple waited until she heard the soft click of the lock being engaged from outside before moving to her own front window. Through a carefully arranged gap in the blinds, she watched the figure emerge from the cottage and begin walking not toward the village centre or the bus stop, but up the lane in the direction of Vane House. The identification was now complete. Only someone with intimate knowledge of the Vane household would possess a key to Miss Marple's cottage, a key that could have been obtained during the recent visits ostensibly made to discuss Mrs. Vane's death. More tellingly, the intruder's destination removed any lingering doubt about their identity and motivation. Inspector Slack emerged from the shrubbery where he had been concealed for the past hour, brushing leaves from his coat with the satisfied air of a man whose patience has been rewarded. The plan that he and Miss Marple had devised had worked exactly as intended. "Got everything we need, I'd say," he murmured to himself, consulting his watch. "Time for the next act." He allowed the intruder a head start before beginning his own journey toward Vane House, moving with the careful stealth of a professional following a suspect. The moon provided sufficient light to keep his quarry in view without risking detection, and the lane's isolation meant there was little chance of innocent witnesses complicating the operation. When the figure reached Vane House and let themselves in through the garden gate, Slack positioned himself in the concealment of the hedge, where he could observe the house's windows. He did not have long to wait. A light appeared in one of the ground floor rooms, the sitting room by his estimation, and remained steady for several minutes. Then came the sound he had been expecting, a cry of frustrated rage that carried clearly through the night air, followed by the crash of something being thrown against a wall. The intruder had opened the envelope and discovered its contents. Slack smiled grimly as he approached the house. Miss Marple's decoy had been crafted with characteristic ingenuity. Instead of the incriminating heater receipts that the thief had hoped to destroy, the envelope contained nothing more dangerous than a church raffle list, a pressed fern from Miss Marple's garden, and a single sheet of paper bearing 3 words written in her unmistakable handwriting. Who tied it? The front door of Vane House stood slightly ajar, evidence of the intruder's haste in entering. Slack pushed it open and stepped into the hallway, his police whistle ready should the situation require assistance. "I think you'll find that envelope rather disappointing, Mr. Vane," he called out in a conversational tone. The sitting room door opened immediately, revealing Giles Vane in a state of considerable agitation. His face was flushed, his hair dishevelled, and his usually neat appearance had deteriorated markedly since their earlier encounter. "Inspector," he said, attempting to regain his composure. "I heard a disturbance and came down to investigate." "Indeed," Slack replied dryly. "And I suppose the envelope in your hand has nothing to do with your recent visit to Miss Marple's cottage?" Giles looked down at the brown envelope as though surprised to find it there. "I don't know what you're suggesting, Inspector. I've been home all evening." "With a key to a dead woman's cottage, were you?" "Most remarkable." Slack produced his handcuffs with deliberate ceremony. "Giles Vane, I'm arresting you for breaking and entering, and for attempted suppression of documents in a criminal investigation." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Giles's remaining composure finally collapsed. "You don't understand," he said desperately. I wasn't looking for anything important. Just some personal papers, IOUS, that sort of thing. Nothing to do with Aunt Honoria's death. We'll sort that out at the station, Slack replied firmly, along with the question of how you came to possess Miss Marple's door key, and why you felt the need to retrieve documents in the middle of the night. As he led his prisoner away from Vane House, Slack reflected with satisfaction on the success of their elaborate stratagem. The bait had been taken, the trap had closed, and one more piece of the puzzle surrounding Mrs. Vane's death had fallen into place. Behind them, the cottage that had played host to this midnight drama settled back into darkness, keeping its secrets until the full truth could be revealed. Chapter 9. The Memorial Service with 2 empty seats. The morning of Miss Marple's hastily arranged memorial service dawned grey and subdued, with low clouds that seemed to press down upon Saint Mary Mead like a weight of collective sorrow. Mrs. Clement had worked tirelessly through the previous evening to prepare the church for the occasion, arranging flowers from village gardens and ensuring that every detail reflected the respect and affection the community felt for their departed neighbour. By 10:30, the small congregation had assembled in the pews with the quiet dignity that marks such occasions. Lady Bantry sat in the front row, dressed in her finest black attire, her eyes already bright with unshed tears. Behind her, the familiar faces of the village arranged themselves according to the unspoken hierarchy of grief and connection. Mrs. Price Ridley, with her usual air of self-importance, slightly tempered by genuine sadness. Old Mr. Carmichael leaning heavily on his walking stick, and the various shopkeepers and residents who had known Miss Marple as customer, neighbour and friend. The Reverend Clement had prepared remarks that emphasised Jane Marple's contributions to village life, her keen interest in human nature, and her remarkable ability to see truth where others saw only confusion. It was to be a simple service, befitting a woman who had lived her life with quiet dignity and unpretentious wisdom. What struck several observers as they waited for the service to begin was the presence of 2 conspicuously empty seats near the back of the church. Mrs. Clement, making a final count of the assembled mourners, noticed immediately that both Miss Beatrice Pike and Mr. Penrith the undertaker were absent. "Most peculiar," she whispered to her husband as he prepared to begin the service. Miss Pike expressed such concern about paying proper respects, and Mr. Penrith has never missed a funeral service in all his years of practice. The Reverend Clement frowned slightly. Professional courtesy alone should have brought the undertaker to the service, regardless of his personal involvement in the arrangements. As for Miss Pike, her absence seemed particularly pointed given her emotional state during their recent conversations about Miss Marple's death. Inspector Slack, who had positioned himself near the church door with the dual purpose of paying respects and observing who attended, found himself increasingly concerned as the minutes passed. The events of the previous evening had left him with more questions than answers, and the absence of key figures from what should have been a routine memorial service struck him as ominous. As the Reverend Clement began his opening remarks, Slack slipped quietly from the church and made his way to Mr. Penrith's establishment. He found the undertaker in his office, surrounded by the paraphernalia of his trade, but clearly in a state of considerable agitation. "Mr. Penrith," Slack said without preamble, "you're missing Miss Marple's memorial service." The undertaker looked up with startled eyes. "Inspector!" "I was just preparing to leave when the most extraordinary thing occurred. I received a telephone call requesting my immediate services at Vane House. Something about collecting that portable heater for proper disposal." "And who made this request?" "That's just it. I assumed it was Mr. Giles Vane, but the voice was somewhat indistinct, rather muffled, as though the caller was speaking through cloth or suffering from a severe cold." Mr. Penrith consulted his appointment book with evident confusion. "But when I telephoned the house to confirm details, no one answered." Most irregular. Slack felt the familiar prickle of professional instinct that warned of developing complications. "Mr. Penrith, I think it would be advisable if you accompanied me to Vane House immediately. There may be matters there requiring urgent attention." The drive to Vane House took them through lanes still damp with morning mist. past hedgerows where the last of the spring flowers nodded in the gentle breeze. Under different circumstances, it might have been a pleasant journey, but both men were conscious of an underlying tension that made conversation difficult. As they approached the house, Slack immediately noticed signs of unusual activity. The front door stood open, and smoke was rising from the kitchen chimney with an intensity that suggested more than ordinary domestic cooking. More ominously, there was no response when they knocked and called out their arrival. "Miss Pike?" Slack called as they entered the hallway. "We've come about the heater." The sound that reached them from the kitchen was that of frantic activity. Papers rustling, metal scraping against stone, and the distinctive hiss of flames consuming substantial material. When they reached the kitchen doorway, they discovered Miss Beatrice Pike kneeling beside the range, feeding documents into the fire with desperate haste. Scattered across the kitchen floor were the remains of the portable heater, now completely dismantled. The device had been broken apart with systematic thoroughness, its components spread across several layers of newspaper like the pieces of a complex puzzle. But it was not the heater itself that held Slack's attention. It was what Miss Pike was attempting to destroy. On the kitchen table, beside the heap of burned paper ash, lay several sheets that had escaped the flames. Even from a distance, Slack could see that they bore official-looking letterheads and what appeared to be medical or chemical terminology. One fragment, only partially burned, showed the words sodium carbonate and wool packing material in neat handwriting. "Miss Pike," he said quietly, "I think you should step away from that fire." She looked up at him with the wild expression of someone caught in an act they knew to be futile. Her hands were blackened with ash and soot, and her clothing bore the evidence of extended contact with the dismantled heater. More tellingly, her fingers showed the same tar stains they had observed previously, now made more pronounced by her recent labours. "It's not what you think," she said desperately, continuing to feed papers into the flames. "I'm simply disposing of old household accounts. Mrs. Vane accumulated such quantities of unnecessary documentation." But Slack had already moved to examine the kitchen mantelpiece, where he found confirmation of what he had suspected since the previous day's visit. The black ribbon that had been used to practice the morning knot lay cut into precise lengths, its ends bearing the telltale tar stains that connected it inexorably to the ribbon on Miss Marple's door. Beside the ribbon, as though abandoned in haste, lay a coil of tarred rope and several pieces of what appeared to be carded wool, the same material that had been found blocking the portable heater's flue collar. "Miss Pike," Slack said with quiet authority, "I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Mrs. Honoria Vane, and for attempting to pervert the course of justice in the matter of Miss Jane Marple's investigation." The effect of these words was immediate and complete. Miss Beatrice Pike's desperate activity ceased abruptly, and she sank to her knees beside the range as though all strength had suddenly left her body. "I never meant for it to happen," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the dying fire. "It was only meant to make her sleep deeply, only to make her keep me on. She was going to dismiss me, you see. After all those years of faithful service, she was going to send me away with barely a reference." The confession that followed would provide the final pieces of a puzzle that had begun with Miss Marple's seemingly innocent questions about a domestic accident, and would end with the revelation of how desperation and long-suppressed resentment had combined to create a tragedy that might never have been discovered without the elaborate deception of a staged death. Chapter 10. Evensong and Miss Marple Alive. The evening service at St. Mary Mead's Parish Church had always been a quieter affair than morning worship, attended by those whose devotion ran deep rather than those fulfilling social obligation. On this particular evening, however, the small congregation was supplemented by several individuals whose presence had nothing to do with religious observance and everything to do with curiosity about the remarkable events that had shaken their peaceful village. As the Reverend Clement concluded his reading from the evening lesson, a slight commotion at the vestry door drew the attention of those seated in the rear pews. The door opened quietly, and a familiar figure slipped into the church with the unobtrusive efficiency of someone well practised in avoiding unnecessary attention. "Miss Jane Marple," very much alive and looking remarkably well for someone who had spent 3 days officially deceased, took her customary place in the third pew from the front. The effect on the congregation was immediate and electric. Mrs. Price Ridley's hymn book clattered to the floor, old Mr. Carmichael rubbed his eyes as though doubting their reliability, and Lady Bantry let out a small cry of joy that she immediately stifled with a handkerchief. The Reverend Clement, who had been forewarned of this dramatic resurrection, continued the service with admirable composure, though several parishioners later remarked that his voice carried a note of barely suppressed satisfaction as he pronounced the final blessing. Following the service, the most curious members of the congregation lingered in the churchyard, hoping for explanations of what appeared to be either a miracle or an elaborate deception. Miss Marple, however, seemed in no hurry to satisfy their curiosity. She exchanged quiet words with Dr. Haydock nodded graciously to Inspector Slack, and embraced a tearful Lady Bantry with evident affection. "My dear Dolly," she said gently, "I hope you can forgive the deception. It was necessary, I'm afraid, but I know how distressing it must have been." "Jane," Lady Bantry managed through her tears, "I thought I had lost you forever. But how? Why? What has been happening?" "All will be explained," Miss Marple promised. "Inspector Slack has kindly arranged for us to use the church hall, and I believe the time has come for a complete accounting of recent events." Within the hour, a select group had assembled in the parish hall. Lady Bantry, the Clements, Dr. Haydock, Inspector Slack, and Mr. Penrith, who had arrived still somewhat bewildered by the day's extraordinary developments. Miss Marple took her place at the front of the small gathering, her hands folded in her lap and her expression grave despite the successful conclusion of her remarkable gambit. "I must begin," she said, "with an apology to all of you, but particularly to dear Dolly for the distress my feigned death has caused. The deception was necessary because someone in our community had committed murder and believed themselves safe from detection." She paused, allowing this statement to settle before continuing. "Mrs. Honoria Vane did not die accidentally. Her death was carefully planned and expertly executed by someone who had both the opportunity and the knowledge necessary to turn a familiar domestic appliance into an instrument of murder." Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "Miss Marple has asked to explain the case herself, given that her unique methods were responsible for solving it." "Thank you, Inspector." Miss Marple's eyes swept the assembled group. "The key to understanding Mrs. Vane's murder lay not in what was present at the scene, but in what was wrong with what appeared to be perfectly normal domestic arrangements." She began with the details that had first aroused her suspicion. The clock wound midweek instead of on its customary Sunday schedule. The log basket moved from left to right of the fireplace, and the general appearance of a room that had been tidied too well by someone unfamiliar with Mrs. Vane's personal habits. These discrepancies told me that someone had arranged the scene after Mrs. Vane's death, someone who knew her routines well enough to approximate them, but not perfectly enough to avoid small errors. Dr. Haydock leaned forward with interest. "And the portable heater?" "The heater was the murder weapon, though cleverly disguised to appear faulty," Miss Marple replied. "The flue collar had been deliberately blocked with soap and carded wool, materials that would create a deadly accumulation of carbon monoxide while being easily removed afterward to destroy evidence of tampering." She explained how the murderer had used their intimate knowledge of Mrs. Vane's evening routine to ensure the victim would be overcome by fumes while alone in the sitting room, then had returned to discover the body and tidy any traces of their interference. "But who could have done such a thing?" Mrs. Clement asked, though her expression suggested she already suspected the answer. "Miss Beatrice Pike," Miss Marple said simply. "Mrs. Vane's companion for many years, someone with complete access to the house and detailed knowledge of her employer's habits, someone who faced dismissal and the loss of her livelihood after years of faithful service." She described Pike's method, the careful preparation of the heater, the staged discovery of the body, and the systematic elimination of evidence. The tar stains that had appeared on the mourning ribbon, the telephone box, and Pike's own hands came from her brother's old sea chest, where she had practiced tying the reef knots that ultimately betrayed her maritime family background. The elaborate mourning display for my supposed death was Miss Pike's attempt to discourage investigation, Miss Marple continued. She ordered the wreath hastily, made errors with my name, and tied the memorial ribbon with knots she couldn't execute properly. Each mistake was a clue pointing to someone desperate to end all inquiry into Mrs. Vane's death. Lady Bantry shook her head in amazement. "But Jane, how could you be certain enough to stage your own death?" "I wasn't certain of the identity," Miss Marple admitted. "But I was confident that Mrs. Vane had been murdered, and that the murderer would reveal themselves if they believed their primary threat had been eliminated. People behave very differently when they think they're safe from observation." Inspector Slack took up the narrative to describe Pike's confession. Her growing desperation as Mrs. Vane prepared to dismiss her, her decision to use a method that would appear accidental, and her panic when Miss Marple began asking inconvenient questions about the scene. She never intended murder initially, Slack concluded. Pike claimed she only meant to make Mrs. Vane unconscious, hoping to convince her employer that she was indispensable during a medical crisis. But the amount of carbon monoxide produced by the blocked heater was far more than she had calculated. The room fell silent as the full tragedy of the situation became clear. A life lost through miscalculation and desperation, another life ruined by the consequences of that fatal error, and a community shaken by the discovery that murder could hide behind the facade of domestic accident. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the quiet dignity that had marked her throughout the investigation. "I learned a great deal from how people tie a black ribbon," she said with a small smile. "But more importantly, I learned once again that guilt has a way of revealing itself to those patient enough to watch and wait." As the gathering dispersed into the mild spring evening, Lady Bantry walked beside her restored friend toward the cottage that had played such a crucial role in the drama. "Jane," she said softly, "promise me you'll never die again. My heart couldn't bear another such deception." Miss Marple chuckled, the sound carrying clearly across the peaceful village green. "My dear Dolly, I can promise that any future deaths of mine will be entirely genuine. Once in a lifetime is quite enough for such theatrical gestures." Behind them, the lights of St. Mary Mead began to appear in cottage windows, marking the return of ordinary life to a community that had witnessed extraordinary events. The case was closed, justice had been served, and Miss Jane Marple was once again available to notice the small details that others overlooked, should the need arise.